the bee, the biology and the queen and the drone biology and the genetic diversity and really the intricacy of the bees and why they swarm. And the second half of the book, Kim discusses the way he explains control, the ways to mitigate a swarm. But what Kim most liked and is very impressive is the book was reviewed. The foreword in the book is from Tom Seeley. And Tom Seeley wrote, every beekeeper who wants honey crops needs to understand how a colony decides to swarm and how to prevent the process. Well, when we hear that, and Wally's the expert in that, we need to get him to speak and teach us something or two. So let's give a warm welcome to Wally.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm sorry, I've got the wrong date on this on the opening slide. That doesn't augur very well. Okay, so just three, setting the scene slides, right? This is an apiary near us, not a home apiary. This is one of our apiaries, and this is looking out over the mountains of Snowdonia, and this is near where our house looks out. So these are the mountains of Snowdonia here, and we have abandoned this apiary. As you can see, it's pretty exposed, and it was okay in summer, but it had a certain amount of trouble in the winter. So this is where Anglesey is. It's this little island here off the north coast of Wales, and it's only just an island in the sense that at its narrowest point, it's about 150 yards wide, what's called the Menai Straits, which is a tidal current going through here. And there are two bridges which link the island to the mainland. So we're not really an island. And then on the island itself, this is where we live around here. We have our apiaries in this sort of area here, fairly near at hand, so to cut down the travelling. We've currently got 6 apiaries, but we're trying to cut down. But it's like all addictions, it's difficult to cut down. And these are the Menai Straits here, and this is where the ferries go to Ireland from Holy Island here, which again is actually an island, but with a very narrow tidal strait. Right, just so you understand some of the things I say, and particularly when we get through to some of the hive diagrams and so on, this is one of our hives in its winter configuration. And this is in our home apiary, which is an orchard. As you can see, there are apple trees behind. And this is actually what got us into beekeeping. The original reason was to get pollinators for a newly planted orchard. So this is the hive, and it's on a mesh floor here. And in this winter configuration, it consists of one deep box and one shallow box. And the terminology here is that's what called a brood and a half system, right? And this is an open mesh floor here, and it has no insert in it during the winter. It's completely open under here, and there's just a narrow gap around the edge here where the ventilation takes place. And under the roof, on top of the hive, we actually have a 25mm layer of insulation on top of the bees. So all the ventilation is at the bottom, and there's insulation at the top. That will help you understand some of the diagrams, and you may find this configuration peculiar. There's a lot of argument in Great Britain about whether it's a good way to keep bees, but there are a lot of people who use it. These are the 2 booklets I'll be referring to, and these are the versions that were actually written and published for the Welsh Beekeepers Association, and these are available for download on our website. They've also been republished by one of the beekeeping book publishing houses in the UK, Northern Bee Books, which you may have or may not have heard of. So these are very much practical manuals here, and they are designed to be taken into the apiary with you when you've got to do some of these things. And I'm going to show you, going to talk about techniques today, and show pictures of how the hives are organized. And you were an exceptional person if you could actually pick up on that first time and then use the same methods in your apiary. You would want a crib sheet in the form of one of these booklets or similar. This is the book that was published, and this was written because over the years I tried to understand the biology behind swarming, in particular how the bees organized it. And I'm not going to discuss that part of the book particularly, although there is one particular part I will have to discuss because it's absolutely vital to the understanding of swarm control. And this book is not on sale in America, but I think I sent Randy some information about how it could be got economically by just buying a box of them, which would actually would enable you to buy it at a cheaper price than beekeepers in this country, because you would actually get it at trade rate. Right, okay, so the two booklets are The Queen Cells in My Hive, What Should I Do? That is simply a diagnostic tree determine the stage of the swarming process that has been reached and help you decide on the best course of action. And that is something that's absolutely essential. When you see swarm cells, you must reach a state of understanding exactly what is happening in the hive before you intercede in any way, because otherwise you could make a dramatic mistake. The apiary guide is a series of management techniques for what I call preemptive and reactive swarm control. And I'll define those terms very shortly, then you'll understand it. And the information is both text, both in terms of text, and has color-coded diagrams on it showing the contents of the various frames as you move them. And so the swarming biology is approximately 60% about the biology, and the other 40% are the contents of these two booklets. So you sort of get you get more for your money there, but on the other hand, perhaps it's not quite so convenient to take out in the apiary as a crib sheet. So what is swarming? Well, it's simply reproduction. It's the colony's sole aim in life to reproduce. And everything that the colony does, it goes simply to improve the chances of successful reproduction. And Celia and Morse state in their book that mature colonies have a natural urge to swarm each year unless weakened by disease or mismanagement. So we should not be at all surprised when colonies choose to swarm. Our beekeeping books are terrible on this. They understate swarming and make beekeepers think that swarming isn't a major issue. And a lot of beekeepers do exactly the same. When we first got into beekeeping and had trouble with swarming, and we asked other people, they had trouble. We didn't get any sensible answers at all. Most of them were either not telling you the truth or simply didn't know what the colonists were doing. Just to emphasize that the honeybee reproductive strategy is totally opposite to that of their close relatives, the ants. Bees go for quality, so they're only capable of making one main new colony a year, and the possibility that they will succeed with after swarms. Ants, on the other hand, go for quantity. They produce thousands of reproductives, male and female, and they go out and they mate, and each fertilized female has to found a new colony completely on her own efforts, and of course the success rate of that is incredibly low. So that's the difference. They're totally different. You may have some people in your association who think probably swarm control is wrong, and they're natural beekeepers, as people sometimes label themselves. Others want to practice swarm control, intensive swarm control, and still other people, particularly commercial beekeepers, who've probably got a lot of hives, are limited by the time and sheer numbers. And one of the questions that needs to be asked when you decide to do swarm control is, how does this impact on the colony? And all the methods that we practice aim to be epicentric. That means putting the colony welfare first, whereas many of the things that beekeepers do are anthropocentric and put human interest first. And there are also other practical issues about swarm control, such as time people have available. They might have distant apiaries. They may not have quite got the skill yet, or some people just aren't really interested in practicing swarm control. They just rather let their bees do their own thing and they enjoy them that way. And that's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this. So the main purpose of swarm control is to ensure a good honey crop. Every time you lose a prime swarm, you lose about half your crop. And if you lose after swarms, by the way, I may occasionally lapse into English and call them cast swarms, but I know you guys call them after swarms. And if you lose some of those, there are still more bees gone, still more of your honey crop. Also, with the prime swarm, you lose a perfectly good laying queen, and the colonies usually requeen in a week or so, but they don't always. And then there's also the question of issuing swarms in an urban area. And we live in a rural area where loss of swarms doesn't really have much impact on anybody. And the shorter the season, the more important swarm control is. So the advantages of not practicing swarm control are that it's obviously more apicentric because it just allows the bees to do what they've evolved to do. It also restocks wild bee nest sites, which I think is important because beekeepers they're often scorned getting swarms from wild sites, and you ought to be very careful of them. They're carrying disease and all sorts of things like that. But in actual fact, because escaped bees are subject to natural selection, when you get them back again as a swarm, they are often a superior adapted bee. There's also less equipment and a lot less work if you don't practice swarm control. Right, now my terminology. Down the years, in the UK anyway, the terminology has been swarm control and prevention, and these two terms have been used more or less indiscriminately, and it's caused a lot of confusion. However, swarming does have a distinct biological threshold, a point of no return, and that is when queen cells are started. And you'll see I've put in here, or is it? And hang on to that thought for a few slides and I'll explain what I mean by that. So the terminology I always use in all things that I write and talk about are preemptive swarm control. And that is what the beekeeper can do before queen cells are present to try and prevent them being started. Whereas reactive swarm control, this is the other side of the threshold, what the beekeeper can do when queen cells are produced and to prevent the loss of swarms. So the first half of the talk is going to be about preemptive swarm control. Oops. Right. And let's try and understand the basic problem that we're dealing with in swarm control. I think we've probably all read Tom Seeley and other people about the sort of nest site that honeybees would choose, which is around about 40 litres in volume. If they can get that, they prefer that over a bigger or a smaller nest site. And a Langstroth deep box is roughly the same as our deep box, about 35 litres. And that the bees regard that as being sufficient space to complete their whole life cycle. And the aim of a colony is to fill this volume with bees, brood, and stored as early in the season as possible. And when this is achieved, this is a sign to them that it's time to swarm. After swarming, the colony gets a new queen and rebuilds and accumulates stores to survive the winter, so they can do a repeat performance the next year. That's their main aim then, is to survive the winter so they can do it again. So how do beekeepers interfere with this strategy? Well, we do it, as we all know, by increasing the amount of space for brood and honey. And we also induce the bees to draw new combs, and we can also relocate brood or split colonies. And all these are simply attempts to simulate nested maturity, to convince the bees they're not mature enough to swarm yet. And of course, this has only become possible with the modular frame, the movable frame modular hive. So the above types of management constitute preemptive swarm control, and it's basically a con trick, and it works on the bees some seasons, but is much more difficult on others. So you can so what happens when preemptive swarm control fails? And you, as I said, you can fool some of the bees some of the time, but you can't fool all of them all of the time. So when queen cells have been started, the beekeeper must move on to reactive swarm control. And this involves some totally different techniques. And certainly in our country, people get the different techniques confused and don't use the right techniques. And these come under the general heading of artificial swarming. And the conventional strategy in artificial swarming is to make the colony think it has swarmed. That's what the manipulations are supposed to do. However, I don't think this is actually possible, and I will explain why I don't think it's possible in a minute. So the method of artificial swarming described in this book is based on a different principle, and when we get to it, it is what is called Snellgrove Method 2. Snellgrove was a man who in 1934 published a very, very good book about swarming. That he was a very clever man, and he did a lot of very close observation on bees. And he invented a method of artificial swarming which he called Method 2. He was a scholar, so he used Latin numbers, by the way. And what we have done is to modify it, and I will explain that modification, what it was aimed to do and what it actually achieved in the second half of this talk. So, signs that preemptive swarm control has failed is when you see queen cups with contents, and this is the biological threshold, the point of no return. It is not, as some books say, when you see drone brood. Drone brood is just another strategy by which a colony can pass its genes on to the next generation, and it is something that they will start as soon as they feel they are in a sufficiently affluent state to support these drones, or when there are drones in the colony. After all, the last thing you want is for a colony to mate its own queens with its mother's drones, because that's a genetic disaster. Queen cups again, colonies just build queen cups at a certain stage in the development in the season, and they may never use them at all during the whole season. We quite often get standing up eggs in cups, and you'll go in one week and there'll be cups, a few cups with standing up eggs in, and you go next time and nothing's happened. Those eggs have just disappeared. And we don't really know quite what that is about, but you could have, this could happen again for the whole season, and the colony will make no attempt to swarm during the season. A lot of beekeepers think destroying these cups is a good thing, but it's yet you're just wasting your time and probably the bees, because they just rebuild them again and then. But cups with contents need to swap to reactive swarm control. So now I go back to my question in red. Are cups what we call charged queen cups, cups with larvae and royal jelly in them, are they really the start of swarming? And as far as the beekeeper can see, that is it. However, there's evidence from observation hives, and this work was done, I think, in the University of Georgia. I can't, yeah, but it mostly down to a man called Stanley Snyder, which you may or may not have heard. He was studying the use of tactile signals in a colony. And what he found was that about a fortnight before queen cells were produced in a colony, the behavior towards the queen suddenly changed. Some of the workers started to subject the queen to the vibration signal, and this occurred with increasing frequency as time went by. And this vibration signal is a worker bee just grabs the queen and gives it a good shaking for 1 or 2 seconds. During this time, she's also fed more. And the result of this is that she goes into overdrive laying eggs. But just before the queen cells are actually produced, this signal ceases, stops dead. And the assumed aim of this is for to provide a large cohort of young bees that will emerge in the colony over the next 3 or 4 weeks during the actual swarming period itself. So when the queen cells are present, this vibration signal starts up again, and again with increasing frequency as time goes by, until just before the prime swarm actually issues from the hive. And during this period, the queen is fed less and she's kept on the move. And the purpose now is to slim her down in preparation for flight. You can now see that these combinations of behavior lasting for just over 3 weeks can be seen as a coordinated plan to ensure the success of swarming. I mean, this is just speculation in my book, but I'm pretty certain that is how it's intended to work. Is this behavior towards the queen a final decision to swarm? This is what really interests beekeepers, because you can't see it. You can't see it. So the beekeeper has no way telling it's even in progress. However, we know, because we use preemptive splitting of colonies for swarm control. We use it for other things as well. We use it for making queens and nukes, but we also use it just as part of preemptive swarm control. If the colony is subject to a fairly radical preemptive swarm control, that is splitting, it does seem to switch off this, what we call latent swarming. And we know this because we do this to the biggest colonies, the ones that we think are reaching the point when they're likely to set up swarming. And such colonies that have been treated in this way do not set up the swarm, maybe for the rest of the whole season, but certainly not for a month or more. So we're pretty sure it stops this latent swarming in its tracks. Now, one of the really poorly understood things, and I don't know how it's understood in America. I mean, what do you guys think is the composition of the prime swarm? Do you think it is the old queen plus the flying bees? In other words, the older bees in the colony. If this is your view, and it is the majority view in the UK, until very recently anyway, and we're starting to make inroads on that on the incorrectness of that information now. In actual fact, the prime swarm is dominated by young bees, and 70% of the typically 70% of the bees that go with the prime swarm are under 10 days old, and that also includes bees that are less than 4 days old. And many of these younger bees may not have actually been outside the hive before, but all they have to do is to follow the leader, and they can form part of the swarm. So the question that I asked very early on in the beekeeping is here, could a swarm with just older bees really succeed? If you just take the flying bees, you'd have totally the wrong mix of skills to start a colony in a new nest site. And in any case, you're not going to get any recruits inside, well, at the very best 3 weeks. Sorry, you're not going to get any recruits inside the best 3 weeks. So most of these older bees would actually be dead before this actually happened. So it really is a totally ridiculous notion. Right, so I'm now going to preemptive swarm control, and I'm not going to labor this too much because you all do this thing anyway in your ordinary management of the place. Right, this is what we're attempting to prevent. This is a colony that is absolutely definitely setting up the swarm, and this is a technique we use, partway through the season when we've done most of the preemptive swarm control to a colony, that is changing combs and moving brood about. We're not intending to do any more. We will just upend the upper box on our hives. Remember, we're on a brood and a half. And we will look at the underside here, you just smoke the surface and get the bees off it. And then you can immediately, this is the most likely place that queen cells will be found. And if you find queen cells in this position, then you have got to deal with that colony. If there are no queen cells, it's all in this position, it's almost certainly certain that there won't be anywhere else. And it saves a lot of time and effort. So most management activities involved in preemptive are multi-purpose. They're really just good beekeeping. You're aiming to promote a large colony, collecting a large crop of honey. And there are other aims as well. In Britain, we are encouraged to renew our brood combs on a regular basis. It is suggested that we do this on roughly a 3-year cycle. So each year we are changing about 1/3 of the brood combs. That's in both the boxes, both the deep and shallow boxes. And preemptive management can also be used to make increase or new queen if required. There are all sorts of things you can do in this period. So most beakers' primary aim is to get a large crop of honey, and for this you need a large colony, because what determines the amount of honey they'll gather is the sort of ratio of foraging strength to the sort of colony overheads. And unless nectar flows are predictable and time limited, And ours are nothing like that ever because of our weather. You need to maintain this colony size for 3 to 4 months. But the larger the colony and the longer it is in that condition, the more likely it is to swarm. So this is a classic catch-22 situation. The very thing that you're trying to achieve by producing a large colony is undermined by the fact they're more likely to swarm. So this is the 5 main strategies that we suggest that beekeepers adopt. And they all have their pros and cons. So the first strategy is to try and keep the colony together for the whole season. In other words, good preemptive control that prevents it producing queen cells. And we actually did rather well this year. We only had 3 colonies out of about 35 production colonies that actually produce queen cells. Other years, almost the whole lot have tried it. The second, and that results in a good crop of honey because the colony stays together as one foraging force for the season. You can split the colony at a carefully chosen point in the season. And for us, that is usually at the end of May, after we've had a spring flow and before the summer flow comes in, because there is then time for both parts of the split to rebuild themselves to make more bees to deal with the main crop. You can wait until queen cells are present and then do an artificial swarm. And this usually results in a reduced crop because, as I will explain later, the artificial swarm part of this is not a very good functional split of the bees. You've got too many old bees and not enough young bees in it. I mean, the whole business about a swarm is that it's the best possible split you could get for both halves of the split to succeed. Well, we can't do that. We can't split them that way because we just can't recognize that ages the different bees. The fourth strategy is just to allow the colony to swarm, ensure that you catch the swarm and hive it and prevent, I've used cast swarms, I mean after swarms, right? And if you're successful in that, you can get quite a good crop from it. And it may be, if the swarming actually occurs early, you may get a very good crop for it because both the swarm and the colony from which it came will produce a substantial quantity of honey. Finally, there is let alone beekeeping, and a lot of beekeepers do this. They just add supers and hope it's going to work, and they don't really do anything below the queen excluder. And this usually results in a poor crop, but sometimes you do get lucky. And it is best to decide on what strategy or mix of strategies you are going to use during the season so that you are ready to deal with it when it happens. And this is one of the ways of dealing with strategies 4 and 5, which is allowing the colony to swarm, which is putting up, you call them bait hives, we call them catch hives. And you put this up in a likely position, not usually best in the apiary, it's usually best a little distant from an apiary, and it's usually best to put it high up. And this is a bait hive that is used with our Anglesey beekeepers training apiary. We have a special training apiary where we train beekeepers. And this has caught several swarms, but none of them have actually been from the apiary itself by strange coincidence. Right, so the triggers for swarming are a mixture of internal and external conditions. So the internal conditions of the hive are the size of the colony, the space for the queen to lay, brood nest maturity, and the age of the queen is sometimes brought into this. Basically, it's congestion in the brood nest. Space for nectar processing and honey storage is important, but not nearly as important as management in the brood area. And of course, the main cause of swarming is supposed to be the production and or distribution of queen substance, and that's thought to be the main mechanism. However, it's interesting to note that over the years, people have sought to control swarming by adding supplementary queen substance to colonies so that they wouldn't swarm, but nobody's ever made it work. Why? I have no idea. And there are external reasons like the time in the season. And for us, swarming urges a peak in May and June, probably a different time for you. And for us, the weather is certainly an underrated factor. Weather, the type of weather we're getting. When we have a run of depressions with rain and wind rushing across the Atlantic that may last for a week or more, and the bees are very much confined to their hives during this period, apart from short periods, we will often find at the end of that period when we open the hives, several of them have started queen cells. They take this opportunity, a sort of downtime, if you like, to actually decide to swarm. I think it's probably just the fact that they, while this weather is on, they are very congested. So we could to some extent control the internal conditions through management of the hive and particularly management of the brood area, but we can do nothing about the time of the year or weather. Right, so these are the main weapons available for preemptive swarm control. And these deal with the internal conditions in the hive. And I've got them under 4 headings here, which I will go through quickly. Comb management, box management, brood relocation, and as we've already discussed, splitting colonies. So I don't know what, do you people clip your queens? You can tell me that at half time. But it is not a method of preemptive swarm control. It does not prevent the initiation of swarm cells. All it enables is a less frequent colony inspection without actually losing the prime swarm, because when the queen can't fly, the prime swarm aborts and they all go back home. But you still have to do something, because if you leave it too long, the swarm will just emerge again with the first virgin queen to emerge, and will probably be bigger than it would have been with the old queen. And the downside of this is that you stand to the chance of losing your valuable existing queens. You'll just die on the ground somewhere. And then, of course, the colony will suffer a delay in getting new recruits. So there'll be a brood gap of about 3 weeks, which will seriously affect the size of the colony. So many of our books give you the impression that you're really being a very poor beekeeper if you don't clip your queens. It should be a standard procedure. And I have never, ever understood this. So comb management, and the aim here is to ensure that most of the combs in the brood area are actually used for brood rearing. Your aim is to minimize the storage of honey and pollen in the brood area. You remove frames that are not being used to their full potential and replace them. And you can replace, if you've got drawn frames, you can replace them with drawn frames, but more often than not, it's better to replace them with foundation that has to be drawn. And drawing comb actually simulates nest immaturity to the bees. We actually start that process in the previous season, when as the last in the last sort of management during the season, we'll move outdated or damaged combs to the outside so that early in the next year they don't have any valuable contents and can just be removed and replaced as foundation. I found one of my booklets is about comb management, by the way, and comb drawing is not well understood by many beekeepers. And there are two rules to comb drawing for a colony. The bees must have an immediate use for the comb to extend the brood nest or for storage. They do not do speculative comb building. In other words, you put a frame, a foundation in, and they don't need the comb where you put it. They won't draw it, they'll just ignore it. There must also be a nectar flow, or the beekeeper must provide one by feeding sugar syrup, because bees do not use stored honey for wax making. All the wax makers go and refuel for their next box of wax down at the bottom of the hive and get direct from incoming bees. Wax is an expensive commodity. They say it takes 8 pounds of honey to make a pound of wax. And also involved in this is local heating, because where the comb is being drawn and formed, you need to have a temperature of about 42 degrees centigrade, because that represents a temperature at which wax becomes much more malleable, and it also has to divert bees from other tasks. So it is an expensive commodity, which is why they control its use, its making so carefully. When you introduce foundation to brood boxes, it must be done at the right time and in the right position. So early in the season, the foundation must be placed at the extremity of the current brood nest. It must be the next comb that the queen will want to lay, right? If the brood nest is going to expand. And in that position, the bees will realize its importance and will draw it. Later, when the colony is crammed with bees, you can be much more ruthless about this. And we quite often interleave frames of foundation with drawn frames with brood in them. And you would be amazed how quickly those frames get drawn and laid by the queen. The one place never to put foundation is next to the hive wall, because that is the last place they will want to draw comb, because it's not their instinct to draw comb on the outskirts of the nest until they absolutely need it. And it's also colder there, so it's more difficult for them to do it. So the use of foundation has the dual purpose of preemptive swarm control and brood frame renewal, and keeping your brood frames young has a big impact on the two main diseases, American foul brood and European foul brood. And the bonus is the queen lays more in new comb anyway. It is a common feature of beekeepers that they have short arms and long pockets, and they do not like to spend money. So a lot of beekeepers are very reluctant to spend their money on foundation. But as in most things, you have to invest to get a return. So with the removed frames, they're taken out of circulation and cleaned up, and they can put new sheet of foundation in them. We recover virtually all our wax, and good frames that contain food but not brood, and that the food might be either honey or nectar or pollen. We will put to one side, and we will use these as feed frames for nukes. In fact, we recover, for the last 5 years, we've actually recovered enough wax each year we have a system by which we can swap wax for foundation with no money changing hands, and we haven't not paid out any money for the last 5 years for our foundation. We've done a straight swap. Right, the method 2. This is what we call box management, and of course it's only possible if you're running a 2-box system. And you're moving boxes with the aim of ensuring that the maximum number of combs beneath the queen excluder are available for the queen to lay. And of course, this depends if the frames themselves are interchangeable. And as you'll have noted that we use a deep box and a shallow box, so our frames are not interchangeable. So what we often do is actually to move. We will, if the upper box, what we call the half brood, actually starts to get honey stored in it, we will quickly move it underneath the main brood box, changing position, and the bees will regard that as being a totally unsuitable place to be storing nectar or have honey, and will quickly remove it and make it available for the queen to lay down into. The target always is to have brood in contact with the queen excluder over as much of its area as possible. As soon as you take the queen excluder off, we want to be able to see brood at the top of those frames. You can never achieve it completely, but it's the aim. And the aim is to avoid honey sitting in the upper box. So there's a serious, seems to me, a misunderstanding about the movement of frames. What we do is to move brood containing frames up into the upper box and move empty frames, either empty ones or with food in them, down to the lower box. If we've got a lot of stores in any of these boxes we're moving down, we will uncap the stores to encourage the bees to remove them quickly. And this is contrary to what beekeeping books say. And I've looked this up in several beekeeping books, and they all recommend that the space for the queen to lay should be above the current brood nest. But if it is above the current brood nest, the bees will just regard it as a super and store honey in the combs. If you go back to the original thing, that the bees actually are looking to live in quite a small volume, then this represents their natural behavior, that when they've got what they require as an adequate sized brood nest, they will then start to store honey. They won't bother with more brood. They'll start to store honey in the space that they normally would do, which is above the brood nest. This actually represents what happens in a nest in a hollow tree, which is fairly elongated. So this is the situation at the end of the winter, and the bees are gradually eating their way up. They've still got some honey left, but now the first brood nest of the year has established itself in this sort of position. And now, because they've taken all the stores from these combs, it will now extend down like this to fill all this vacant comb. So that is the natural way that they behave. Supering a hive, this is not a big deal. You add super when a flow is expected or when the previous supers are full of bees. Whether you add supers at the top or the bottom, there's absolutely no evidence that it affects honey production. However, it is well known that a surplus of drawn comb on a hive stimulates foraging. Bees sense that is there, ready to be filled, and they will forage harder to fill it. Boxes of foundation, of course, should be added low down, so that they're in a fairly warm place for the bees to draw them. And you have to remember that the volume of nectar coming in is about 3 or 4 times that of the honey that it will eventually be. So the bees always need extra space in order to process this efficiently. So does super management influence swarming? I'm not sure how important it is. As I said, generous supering is not a substitute for poor management below the queen excluder. Drawing wax in the supers is supposed to inhibit swarming, but I'm not sure it's as effective as drawing comb in the brood area. It does give space for the bees to hang out, but certainly in the sort of bad summer weather we get, most of the bees come down into the brood area to keep warm and to keep the brood warm. If you add too many supers, you can result in part-filled boxes and frames, which is a bit of a problem, can be a bit of a problem when you come to the honey harvest. In our climate, over-supering can create extra volume in the hive and give that colony thermoregulation problems. So right now we're on to the third method, which is brood relocation. And this is one of the oldest tricks in the book, invented in America, the Demaree method that was first published in 1892. And this consists of removing frames from the bottom of the hive and relocating them in the box at the top of the hive above the supers. And this, the main function is that, well, there are 2 functions of this. First of all, it attracts nurse bees from the main brood nest to go off and look after this brood. So it reduces congestion at the bottom of the hive. And because this, of course, no brood is actually taken out of the hive, it's not like splitting a hive. All the brood remains in the hive, so it does not affect the colony size. And it isn't actually, some people think that if you move brood to the top of the hive and give them the bees an entrance to fly from there, that this is a Demaree. It certainly isn't, because that separates the colony and it's something else again. And of course, in exchange for the frames of brood you have put up to the top of the hive, you can, in the bottom of the hive, you could add extra frames, preferably drawn ones if you've got them, which give it more space for the queen to lay. She may have a fewer nurse bees available to her, but she would usually make a very good job of laying all these extra frames. There are many variations on the method, but the basic principle is to remove a brood from the bottom of the hive to the top. The intended full version of the method is that when frames of brood at the top of the hive have the brood has emerged, they are returned to the bottom of the hive in exchange for another batch of ones containing more recent brood, which is a sort of frame recirculation system. But this doesn't really work, because as soon, or we find it doesn't anyway, because as soon as the brood emerges from these frames at the top of the hive, they tend to get backfilled with nectar. So they're not really available for laying by the time they're ready to go back to the bottom of the hive. Originally, this was designed for hives on double or even triple deep boxes, and this is really very big colonies involved, but this isn't the sort of thing we keep. So that's a classical Demaree done more or less with one of our hives. We've actually got a colony here on a double deep box, and it's the time in the season when they've filled a couple of honey supers as well. So we've now taken one of these boxes, put most of the brood in one of these boxes at the top of the hive, and provided new frames for the queen to lay at the bottom. And what I should actually have done in this diagram, obviously, it obviously wants another super on it, which is a perfectly easy thing to do. You have to watch out for it because this box at the top of the hive may be far enough away from the queen for them to decide that they're queenless and start emergency queen cells. And you have to prevent that happening because you do not want a queen emerging in that top box and possibly finding a way down through the supers and squeezing through the queen excluder when what happened next would be unpredictable. She might actually kill the existing queen, as the existing queen might kill her. It gives an uncertainty to what's going to happen. So as I said, restarting this frame is difficult because they get filled with honey. But you do finish up the end of the season extracting some of your honey crop from brood frames. We do try to avoid that as much as possible because the honey is slightly different from brood frames than it is from dedicated super frames. But as long as your brood frames are not really old, I don't think it really affects the honey quality to any significant degree. Right, this is the last method of preemptive swarm control. And all the previous methods have kept the colony in one piece. Because splitting is different, you now create two potential colonies from one. However, splitting a colony is the most powerful and reliable method of preemptive swarm control. And it also serves a dual purpose because not only does it provide a high measure of swarm control, preemptive swarm control, but it gives you also the chance to make increase or raise a new queen, because a new queen will be produced whether you like it or not. If you didn't want it, you can always reunite it later in the season. In the UK, it's a well-established practice with people who get most of their crop from heather honey, which is the main crop of the season. And beekeepers there will, in May, they will make a nucleus from their colony, take enough frames of brood and bees to make a nucleus. It'll establish a new queen. And by the time you get through to July, which is the time that the bees are moved up to the heather moor, that nuke will have got a new queen, and then unite the two colonies to make a super colony to go up the heather, and that will collect a lot more heather honey. It's what we're coming down on to deal with a gentleman called Snellgrove, who invented a split board. And this is exactly what he invented his split board to do, to enable him to split his colonies. He wanted to split all the colonies that looked as though they were going to swarm before they actually started it. Right. Beekeepers are very reluctant to split colonies because they say it's bound to reduce the honey crop, but splitting is always better than letting hives swarm. That is, unless you can guarantee catching the swarm. How good it is depends on the timing of the split. And I said earlier in the different options for preemptive swarm control, if you're done at the right time, directly after the spring flow, it can give an enhanced yield. And we don't have oilseed rape canola in your terms on Anglesey anymore, but that used to be, when that ceased to flower, that used to be the ideal time to split the colonies. And the two resultant colonies may produce more than the original one. Just as an example, and it's a rather extreme example, it's boasting really. we had one colony from which we wanted to breed, and we had an early season when we were able to split it in late April and again at the end of May. So 2 times. We made 7 nukes out of this, where the queen cells were produced by that colony, and all the bees and brood that went to furnish the nukes came from that colony. At the end of the season, it yielded 110 pounds of honey, and it actually stored enough honey to overwinter. It didn't have to be given any supplementary feeding. That is the exception rather than the rule, I should add. So here is a colony that we split earlier, and I'll just go through it from top to bottom. Here is the original deep box, which has the old queen in it, and above that are 1, 2, 3, 4 supers. And then there's this split board here called the Snellgrove board that I'll talk about later. Then is a second brood box that contains the new queen, and then it has 4 supers again on top of that. And the bottom part of the hive contains 75 pounds of honey, and the upper part contains 60 pounds of honey. So a total of 135 pounds of honey, which is pretty good. And the only snag about this was my wife used to do a lot of swim team management, and she was actually out of the country when it came to harvesting this honey. And I had to harvest this hive of my own. As you can see, it's a bit of a tower block. I'm not as young as I used to be. And I had to do this from a step ladder on what is sloping and fairly soft soil. And over here is a barbed wire fence, which I had a very narrow squeak actually landing up on. So in future, if I got anything resembling this, I would engage some help if my wife wasn't available, but we try and avoid it now, to be honest. So you have to know how to split a colony when swarm control is the main aim. And to achieve the control, you want to achieve control that's going to last for the rest of the season. So how much control is enough? And this really is something you have to learn for yourself. I can't give you any hard binding rules about how a colony should be split. There are certain rules, though. You must ensure that both sides of the split are viable. In other words, they've got all the resources they need. The timing is right for the colony itself, and the timing is right for honey production. And this controlled split will give you, because it's a controlled split, you can do something to organize the age classes of bees better than is required in an artificial swarm, and they will rebuild very quickly if you do it right as well. So one part has the old queen and the other part has to raise a new one. The queen right part normally remains on the old hive site where it will gather in the flying bees, and the queenless part goes to a new location, which is either a separate stand or if you're using a split board on top of the queen right one, which is what you saw in the previous slide there. This part will lose all its flying bees back to the queen right part, of course, and you must allow for this. And this is sometimes very tricky. We did some splitting 1 year after we'd had, towards the end of May, after which we had some exceptional weather in May, and there'd been a hell of nectar flow. And we had not realized just what proportion of the colony had been converted to foragers. So that when the flying bees left a split we had made and went back to their old site, it left that part of the split desperately short of brood, so that actually some of the brood could not be kept warm and it died. That's the only time that we've got that extreme. It's something you have to bear in mind when doing a split, to try and guess what proportion of the bees in that colony actually have been flying. The queen right spot is normally the main honey producer. It has the queen and some new combs to lay in, and she'll lay absolutely flat out to rebuild the colony. But you don't want it to rebuild so quickly it returns to a condition it may decide to swarm. So it's a bit like walking a tightrope walk, really. No precise recipe is possible. This is where your experience as a beekeeper and judgment comes into play. Now, the queenless part makes a new queen, must have the resources to do this, must have the brood to make emergency queen cells, must have the nurse bees and the food. I don't know what your view of emergency queens is, whether you regard them as being inferior to swarm queens or red queens or whatever, but there is absolutely no evidence that this is the case. There's been quite a lot of research done on this, and the bees aren't mugs. They're making, when they're making an emergency queen, it is their future at stake, and they will turn all the resources available to them onto this to make good queens. And it is easier on a split board because you do get extra warmth from the colony below. I reckon the minimum is probably about 5 frames of brood on the split board. That's the one that's going to, it's not got the queen, it's going to make a queen. And if you're doing it on a new stand, I would suggest something like 7 frames, a few more frames is really required. Oh, here's an example of doing it. Here is a colony as it might be at the end of May, and it's getting pretty crammed and got a lot of brood. And so we would split it thus. We would get a new box. This is a new box here. Put 3 frames of brood in it. And then we would, and then as another 9, we have 12 frame hive, another 9 frames that the queen can lay. In the box over here, we put the remainder of the frames, and these would contain eggs and young larvae from which queens were produced, and the flying bees would all go back to here, and this would become the main foraging colony. So that's the sort of that split would usually be radical enough to prevent that colony swarming for the rest of the season. So it's really a very highly flexible process. Once you're familiar with the process, you can design a split to meet your particular situation. And to achieve the ends that you want from it, whatever they are. Well, with preemptive swarm control, you can't win them all. Even the best preemptive swarm control, including splitting, will not work 100% of the time. And but it will always delay the swarming impulse. There is no doubt about that. However, colonies may retain the swarming impulse up to the end of the swarming season, which for us is late June and July. And again, for us, this is just when the main flow is starting. So it could hardly be worse timing. And that's for both of you actually now. For you, because it's having to artificially swarm the colony now is going to affect the foraging force in that colony, so you won't get as much honey. And for them, because it is now so late in the season, that if you allow them to swarm, the possible success in this swarm establishing somewhere is very much reduced. If you catch the swarm, that's all right, you can look after it. But if it escapes into the wild, its chance of survival are very much reduced. So what do you do then? We have developed a method to deal with this now, but in actual fact, I'm not going to deal with it in this lecture tonight. It's a bridge too far, but it is in the book and in the booklets. Right, this is a clear sign that preemptive swarm control has failed. We've got plenty of swarm cells here, and this is proof, the ultimate proof that it's failed. This is in our orchard, and we've got a swarm in one of our apple trees, which when we first started beekeeping, believe me, it was a familiar sight. We got a lot of swarms, and these apple trees were actually the ideal place for the swarms to gather. So we were usually, as long as we made easy in the home apiary, because we can just go down there at lunchtime and see if there are any swarms and then gather them. But in an out apiary, that's not possible. Right, so that's sort of half time, and if anybody has any burning questions, I will answer them. I will have a quick swig of tea, and then if there's nothing required, I will resume.
So anybody interested can unmute themselves and ask Wally a question. Feel free.
So I have a question. This has been really good. So
I think you'll have to get other people to mute themselves. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, go for it.
Go ahead there, Barbara. We've muted. You should be good.
Okay. So when you do the, I'm sorry. When you're doing the Greer.
I'm sorry, 1 second, Barbara. This is Robert Najjar. Chuck Kyle, somehow your microphone keeps coming off and off mute. And so we hear a lot of interference. If you would please mute yourself.
Okay.
Barbara, third time is a charm.
I'm just going to type it.
If you want to type, you can type. This isn't working. Perhaps you would like to. Send the questions in. I'm getting really big feedback of myself at the moment, which isn't good. Shall I resume, Randy?
Yes, let's give it a try.
I think it's we do manage to manage this, but you have to be very careful how you manage this.
Do you see her question, or shall I read it to you?
Yeah, you can ask me at the end. You've got a bubble for questions, haven't you? And I'll try and deal with the questions at the end.
Yes, she says, when doing the de Greer method, what temp is it usually? I would worry about the brood at the top being chilled.
Well, it doesn't happen because it's part of the main hive, so it's getting all warmth from the bottom of the hive. And I mean, you are doing that at a time when the colony is absolutely crammed with bees. There's no point in doing it before it is in that state. So no, I've never had any problem. The only problem that, as I explained, arises is if you are splitting a colony and too many flying bees abandon the queenless part of the split so that they can't sustain themselves properly. That's the only time that happens. Okay, I'll resume. So I do, this is a question that it may be rhetorical, I don't know. I don't know whether you actually have a recommended method of artificial swarming. I have been unable to determine that you do have a recommended method in America. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a talk from Jamie Ellis. Oops, sorry, just dropped something. Oh yeah, okay, hold on, I dropped my mouse. Right, okay. We had a talk from Jamie Ellis, and he obviously didn't know anything about artificial swarming. In the UK, we do have a standard that a method, which is in all the beekeeping books. And this was our starting point when we took up beekeeping. And it proved highly unreliable. And the books don't tell you that. And you need to know this. All right, so development of our methods of artificial swarming, it's quite a long story. And it lasted for it's about 15 years of trial and error. You didn't never find out anything without making errors and experimentation. And because we had quite a lot of hives, we were prepared to experiment, because losing 1 or 2 hives was not a big deal. I think we might say that our efforts showed persistence, if nothing else. And this story is actually related in chapter 1 of the book, when I explain the evolution of the methods that we now use ourselves and recommend to you. And I'm not going to cover that in the talk. Anybody gets the book, they can read the story. It has some funny sides to it. So reactive swarm control starts when preemptive swarm control ends. And that's when queen cells and contents are found in the hive. And there is absolutely no reliable way of turning this process off. Destroying queen cells only delays swarming, and repeated frustration of the colony, by interfering with queen cells, makes their response also very unreliable. If you repeatedly destroy queen cells, that colony will often swarm without really have any provision for a new queen. They may just have started some queen cells and then they're off. So it's much better if the beekeeper accepts the inevitable. If you do the wrong move now, the colony can be lost. I mean, the favorite one is to actually destroy queen cells without noticing that the prime swarm departed a few days ago, and there is now no brood left in the colony from which they can make an emergency queen. And that actually was the reason I wrote the original booklet about the queen cells in my hive, because we have a bee inspection service in Britain, and their chief officer says, our seasonal bee inspectors go around, they go to somebody's apiary and later in the season, and they look at this colony and they say, oh, Mr. Jones, this colony doesn't appear to have a queen. Do you know what happened? And he'd say, oh, well, he said, well, a couple of months ago, I saw some queen cells, but I destroyed them. And what he'd actually done was to destroy them after there was no way that the colony could recover. And this was quite a widespread problem, apparently. So, what I'm going to deal with tonight is when a colony has got swarm cells, but has not yet lost the prime swarm. And the only solution to this is artificial swarming. And I've said this is usually taught as a recipe, but it is helpful, and this was part of the aims of my book, to understand, but to better understand the beekeeper's interaction with the colony. So it would help to know how swarming actually works. And this is not fully understood, and it's very difficult to study because the moment you open a hive to see what's going on, you interfere with what is going on. It's inevitable. And this was the aim of my book. And the book actually contains what I call a working hypothesis to try and explain what the beekeeper is up against in artificial swarming. And this working hypothesis runs as follows, that the swarming process actually has a group of what I call swarm organizer bees. And that in actual fact, the rest of the colonies are mere passengers, spelt wrong, in this process. These swarm organizer bees can only be identified at the point of swarming when they are the bees that actually initiate the swarming process. In other words, they say, it's time to go, girls. And they also lead this swarm out, and they probably also form the initial group of scouts that look for a new home. And these bees are obviously flying bees, because what information do they need to be in their possession in order to know when to swarm? Well, they have to know the maturity of the queen cells, don't they? They have to know that there are queen cells at or near ceiling, and they have to know that the weather outside is suitable to do this. Therefore, they must be flying bees. And they are just a small majority of the flying bees, probably. And we, the beekeeper, are able to distinguish them from dedicated foragers. And the speculation in the book is that, are these bees actually the same bees that started the queen cells, or do they go back even further? And were they the bees that started this vibration signal on the queen in order to do the pre-preparation for swarming? And this is something we don't know. But what really matters is that what's really essential is that understanding the swarm organizer bees are part of the flying bees. The initiation of the swarm lasts about an hour. Interestingly, all the workers in a colony engorge with honey and put on board about 30 milligrams of honey. The workers are stimulated to warm up their flight muscles, and the swarm initiators make buzz runs across the combs, and various squeaking noises can also be heard emanating from the workers. The queen is chased and molested by workers, and finally the swarm emerges from the entrance in a continuous stream. So the basis of all methods of artificial swarming is to separate the flying bees and the queen cells from the sorry, is to separate flying bees and the queen cells into an artificial swarm. The remainder of the colony, which contains most of the brood and the queen cells, is called the parent colony. And this always has to be in a new position, be it on a separate hive stand or on a split board. And the question is, to which of these parts does the queen go? And the swarm initiators are flying bees, so all of them will automatically relocate their cell in the artificial swarm, which is on the old hive stand. And what determines the outcome of this process, whether it is successful or not, is the information that is available to the artificial swarm. What does the artificial understand about what has happened? Because this determines their subsequent behavior. So, right, just as a slight photographic interlude, we arrived in one of our apiaries just as the swarm was up in the air, and we didn't manage to get the camera out before the last few bees were actually leaving this hive. This hive is swarming, right? And it was conveniently gathering nearby on the tip branches of a lilac bush, which has now got so many bees on that it's weighed down to the ground, right? And after a bit of fiddling around, we managed to gather this swarm. We actually gather swarms in a cardboard box that has been liberally painted with beeswax, and then we wrap it up in a old sheet like this, and then it goes away, usually to be hived in a different apiary. And you will note that the person who is collecting this swarm forgot to zip up his bee suit properly. Most swarms are usually benign and nothing happened. Right, now you need to go back to remember the age composition of a natural prime swarm. And as I said in the earlier slide, it actually contains about 70% of bees are less than 10 days old. And it's interesting, this year is the 82nd anniversary of the publication of the research that made this discovery. This was a very famous researcher in Britain called Colin Butler. He was also the man who discovered queen substance, by the way. And this is a totally different age composition to the artificial swarm we have just created, and we are unable to replicate it. There's no way we can do that. The booklet contains a linear diagnostic key comprising 12 steps, and each step tells you what to look for in a hive to find out what stage the swarming process has reached, and also advises you as the best solution to this in terms of management. Right, okay. What I think the problem here is, and I should have been on this slide, is that this artificial swarm you have made does not really understand what's happened, because there it is with a queen. I've got slightly muddled in my bear with me, I've got slightly muddled in the order of things. Okay. So that is that. Sorry about that. So what we're going to do with tonight is colonies that have set up queen cells but have not yet swarmed. As I said, the solution to this is artificial swarming. And in the booklet there, it deals with other things. It deals with colonies that have already actually issued the prime swarm, but none of the other queen cells have emerged yet, which means there's no queen in the colony. And therefore, it cannot yet have produced an after swarm. And then there are those that you go into, and it is clear that there are some queens have emerged, but you have no way of knowing if it is issued an after swarm. And then the fourth category is last ditch post-swarming management, when you've really failed to observe what's going on and you do not want to end up with a queenless colony. And there are various steps you can take to avoid that. So if you are trying to exercise fairly rigid swarm control, and if the colony has got past this stage one, then you've taken your eye off the ball. And that's just that bottom line. So when you go into a colony and you see queen cells in it, you actually have to determine whether these queen cells are there because the colony is intending to swarm. And 9 times out of 10, they probably will be. But it could be something else altogether. It could be the colony was attempting to replace its queen through supersedia, or they might be emergency queen cells. I'm sure anybody who has been beekeeping for a few years has managed to kill a queen when they're inspecting a colony. And when you go for the next time to that colony, you will find that it's got a number of emergency queen cells in it, and that the maturity of these queen cells can be dated to the time when you were last in the colony, and you know that you are the culprit here. I mean, it happens from time to time. Swarming and supersedia can actually be ambiguous. Sometimes it can be quite difficult to tell whether these are swarm cells or they are attempting to replace the queen. And there's some more detail of this in the book to tell you how to diagnose this. I mean, we actually, when I said we had 3 colonies set up, of our own colonies set up swarm cells last year, which is about a record, I think. One of those colonies wasn't actually intending to swarm. And we didn't find that out till after we'd artificially swarmed it. And that one was actually a supersedia attempt. And everybody was happy because actually the artificial swarm enabled it to requeen just fine, get a supersedia queen. And everybody lived happily ever after. But we did make a mistake. So there we are. That is completely unambiguous, as I say. You could not mistake that for anything other than swarming. However, you may or may not have noticed that there is often quite a large variation in the number of queen cells that are produced for swarming. Sometimes a lot, sometimes very few. People say it is characteristic of the colony. I have some doubts about that. Certainly it varies from season to season. Some years they produce a lot of queen cells and sometimes they don't. But the other thing that I'm sure now influences the number of queen cells is how energetically you have practiced preemptive swarm control. What you must realize that when you are practicing preemptive swarm control, you're trying to prevent the colony from sensing it wants to swarm. And you're doing this by reducing the information on which they would base this decision. So it's not surprising that the number of bees that you actually persuade it's time to swarm is smaller when you exercise preemptive swarm control. So the actual number of queen cells can be very small. On occasion, they will almost produce these queen cells covertly. They haven't really got a proper majority of bees that, or a quorum that are determined on swarming. And these queen cells, instead of appearing near the middle of the hive where they normally appear, they are hidden away in outer frames, usually high up in the hive. And this is quite an interesting observation. Right, that's definitely too late to make an artificial swarm, but of course, you now have to determine where it came from so that you can prevent after swarm. So when you see swarm cells in a hive, the golden rule is that you must investigate first and act afterwards. So the first priority is to determine what stage of swarming has been reached. As I say, the booklet takes you through that as a linear decision tree. And you have to inspect the colony to see what stage has reached. And the evidence is there, written on the combs for up to 3 weeks, possibly more. You just know how to read it. Do absolutely nothing until you know what's going on. It's only then you can decide on an appropriate method of reactive swarm control. So let's assume let's assume we're trying to determine the colony is not yet swarmed. How do you know? Well, evidence in the order of reliability is you open the hive and you can see the queen. And that's, of course, an absolute banker. You could also see recently laid eggs, and a recently laid egg is standing on its end. And I have a picture of some eggs here standing up in the bottom of cells. But in actual fact, they're not quite as upright as they were when they were first laid. So these eggs might actually have been laid 12 hours or possibly hours ago, a bit longer ago. In the second day after laying, they're about 45 degrees. And on the third day, they're lying flat at the bottom of the cell. And this does tell you when these eggs were laid. Another thing is that there are no missing bees from the colony. It is the size you're expecting it could be. And we almost always realize that a colony has swarmed when we come to expect it. And we have to take the supers off to get to the brood area to look for queen cells. And we notice the supers don't contain the number of bees that were there the last time we looked at it. And that's an absolutely sure sign that the colony has swarmed. There is one exception here. From time to time, you actually get a queen who can't or won't fly, even though we don't clip queens. Occasionally, queens will refuse to fly, or for some reason, and it's usually not obvious, they're not damaged in any way, refuse to fly, and then the queen will go out with the prime swarm, and after a while, the rest of the swarm will just go back home and discuss to leave it to die on the ground. And you may have a full complement of bees there and you can be misled by this. And other guidances are the maturity of the queen cells and the recent weather and the time of day. If you go in early in the morning and there is no sign of swarming, that is reliable. If you go in late in the afternoon, that colony might have swarmed in the middle of the day. Got to be careful. So, okay, the colony has not swarmed, and you need to make an artificial swarm. And how urgent is this? I mean, you have to look at what's there, the maturity of the queen cells. Are they all unsealed as yet? Are they a mixture of sealed and unsealed? Or are they all sealed? If they're all sealed, then the queen is still there. You've been quite lucky, because they probably should have swarmed unless the weather was against them. The time of the day and the weather conditions. But you really must face it, this is an urgent, making the artificial swarm is urgent. And during the swarming season, if you're going out to out apiaries, you must ensure that you go prepared for all eventualities, so that you can set to there and then and make an artificial swarm. And this is particularly true if you're out apiaries are at some distance from where your main store of equipment is. Right, so I'm going to discuss the methods of artificial swarming now. So the standard method in the UK separates the flying bees and the queen from the brood and queen cells. And this is called the Pagden method, albeit that it has several minor variations, but the principle is always the same. But how does this method work? And most books give you the impression that there is no problem. It is assumed that it works well. Indeed, there is one very influential source who makes a positive claim that it is virtually 100% reliable. Well, we started out using this, and our experience was that it less than 50% of the time it actually worked, and that the artificial swarm would at some time over the next 3 weeks issue a swarm itself. And this is the Pagden method, and there's a whole series of diagrams like this in the book. And this just shows what I've just said. Here we have a typical colony, say at the beginning of June, and it's got a super and a half of honey on it. It's got a good amount of brood, and the queen's there, and it's formed some queen cells, right? So what you do, and this is shown as it being done horizontally, not using a split board. You establish you move all this part of the colony to a new stand. So you need a new floor to put it on, a new roof and all that, right? And on the original stand, you introduce a new box, and preferably this wants to be a drawn cone, but sometimes you have to compromise. It has to be a mixture of that and foundation. It just slows things up, that's all. It doesn't affect the principle of the thing. In this box, you are advised to put one brood frame out of here, and this brood frame must contain sealed brood or brood of an age that they cannot possibly make emergency queen cells out of it, right? And yep, the flying bees fly back here, fine. And those include our swarm initiator bees, swarm organizer bees. And this part still has the queen cells in, and the books vary in their advice about what you should do with these queen cells. Some books say you should thin them down to one queen cell, so this colony will not swarm. But in actual fact, that's completely incorrect. This colony has lost the swarm organizer bees to here and no longer has an urge to swarm. So it will choose itself a new queen out of these queen cells and get her mated without any attempt to swarm. So that's the Pagden method, right? And that's the method that doesn't work because these bees in here basically don't know what the hell's going on. They've got a queen, but they've got the wrong bees with which to swarm. So they have, I think it says in the next slide. Yeah, okay. The artificial swarm's in the original hive and it's supposed to think it's swarm. But of course, just explained, it's got the wrong bees, it hasn't. And the parent colonies, I've said that slide actually. So we tried the Pagden method and variations many times over the years. And as I said, it was never better than 50% success. So what went wrong? We were fairly new beekeepers. So our first thought was our fault, we were doing something wrong. So we checked that carefully. Were our bees peculiar? Didn't they behave normally? And it took us some years to come to the conclusion the method was genuinely unreliable and what it said in the bee books was not correct. I've given lectures on artificial swarming to a number of beekeeping associations. And one question I always ask the audience is, if there's anybody in the audience who has used the Pagden method and found it works, will they please share their secret with us? And quite a lot of people stood up and said, thank God somebody said the Pagden doesn't work. I've been trying it for years and can't make it work. We did have one beekeeper who stood up and said, oh yes, I've made it work. And I said, yes, tell us about it. She said, well, I'm in my second year of beekeeping and I've done it once and it worked for me. So we didn't really regard that as being a very reliable testimony. So why doesn't it work? Well, of course, because the artificial swarm with the queen and the flying bees has totally the wrong structure. It's nothing like a natural swarm. It could not occur naturally. The colony does not understand what's happened. And there really are only two things it can do. It can either settle down and rebuild, which is what it's supposed to do, or resume the urge to swarm and do so despite having the wrong mix of bees, which means that the swarm anyway is very unlikely to succeed to establish itself anywhere. And we found there was no way for us to predict or influence this outcome in any way. It just happened more or less randomly. Right, we had, I've called it a moment of serendipity. That is when something totally unexpected happens to you and it turns out to have big advantages. And it happened when a non-beekeeping friend gave us a book. And this book was really the standard book on swarming in the UK by a gentleman called Louis Snellgrove. And this was first published in 1934. And this book is still in print, and it's on its 16th edition. And it's on many beekeepers' bookshelves, obviously, and is still little understood by most people. In fact, a number of beekeepers I've met have the split board that Snellgrove devised amongst their equipment, but hardly anybody knows how to use it. They've never really attempted to find out properly what this board was used for. But this is a Snellgrove board, and basically it's an all singing, all dancing, multi-purpose split board. And it consists of a board with a bee space above and below, and around the side there are paired doors that can be opened and closed. So underneath this door there is another door leading to the bottom side of the board, and it has a piece of mesh in the middle by which air from the colony below can penetrate up, but the bees can make antennal contact through it. But that doesn't, some people say it's important. I never found it is. And this is what it looks like. These are some bees using the entrance to the top part of the board, which they use quite happily. Snellgrove's reason for inventing this board, and it was just another split board, it's not a new idea. They go right back into the 19th century, the boards, was designed so he could preemptively split colonies before they started queen cells, and for this purpose it works well. He had some theories about swarming that required him to do some rather complex door manipulations, which is what really puts people off, because they sound very complicated. You have to do this after 5 days, that after another 5 days, and things like this. But in actual fact, he was working on the basis of what's called the Gerstung theory of swarming, which in a nutshell says that swarming is down to the fact that there is an excess of nurse bees producing brood food compared with the number of larvae that need to be fed. And this excess brood food is used to start queen cells. And this was the theory that held sway for around about 60 years and was finally disproved by some very neat little experiments done by a guy in the UK, actually. Actual fact, most things that a beekeeper wants to do can be done with a much simpler board, which I'll show a picture of now. This is what Snellgrove called his method 1, and it was quite simply preemptive splitting of colonies. Right, so you can just, this is what we call a cover board, you call a top board, and this is a top board that's it's got bee space on both sides. We just had a slot cut in the rim, and then we've covered, this is where we put our bee escapes for when we harvest honey, and we just put mesh over them. So it's just like the other board, but it's now only got one entrance to its top side. And this is perfectly adequate to use for artificial swarming, no problem. Snellgrove, big skill was he was a very good observer, and what he observed led him on to other ideas. And like all of us, some of his colonies he did not split in time for them. They'd already started queen cells. So he dealt with this by making a vertical artificial swarm. But in actual fact, that the method of doing it on a split board rather than a separate hive stand is exactly the same as Pagden, has all the problems that Pagden is. And not surprisingly, he got the same result. Although I have to admit that he doesn't acknowledge this in his book. He doesn't say that it didn't work properly. Yeah. But Snellgrove made a mistake when he was doing his splitting colonies, when he was trying to do this Pagden method with the split board. And he accidentally got the queen in the parent colony rather than in the artificial swarm. So the queen was now with the brood and the queen cells and the young bees. And most beekeepers intuitively believe you have a queen with queen cells, that's bound to swarm. But that is not the case. When he came back 10 days later to see whether his intended Pagden swarm had worked, he was surprised to find that the queen was in the parent colony, but that all the queen cells had been torn down and said queen had resumed laying. So his reaction then was to return that queen to the artificial swarm. And because the queen had resumed laying, the parent colony now had brood from which it could make emergency queen cells. And it did. And that is what he called his method 2. This is method 2 then, and you can compare this with the Pagden. Here you have your same colony with swarm cells, and the whole of this part of the colony with the brood in goes on split board at the top of the hive, right? And as before with the Pagden method, you remove one frame of sealed brood and put it in the bottom box. And this is there because bees will very, very rarely abscond. If they've got brood present, they will stay with the brood. So that's what that's there for. And so why does the parent colony behave like this? The important thing is that flying bees contain the swarm organizers, and they have left the parent colony. In their absence, as we discussed before, the parent colony totally loses its impulse to swarm. And after a few days, they realize that they have a queen, so they don't need another one. So they tear the queen cells down and put the queen back into lay. That's why that happens. So then, after 9 or 10 days, Snellgrove came back and he transferred the queen back into the artificial swarm. And I have just shown it there as though she were actually returned on the frame on which she was currently on at the time. It's really not a big deal. Meanwhile, up here, she has been laying during these 9 or 10 days, and they will immediately start to produce emergency queen cells and requeen themselves. Right, so that is Snellgrove's method 2, and remember our method is called Snellgrove true modified. I'm now going to explain the modification. But we found out this was far more defendable than Pagden, and not 100%. And the problem arises with it because the artificial swarm, now without a queen, is really desperate. It realizes it has no queen and no means of making one. So its behavior is rather desperate, and it tries to find out where the queen has gone. It searches around desperately for her. And sometimes they succeed and they start to join the parent colony up on this split board, and they do so in increasing numbers. So when the swarm organizers get there, in fairly short order, that colony will resume the swarming impulse and issue a swarm. Now, this is actually easily prevented, and Snellgrove recommended this. You just move the parent colony on the split board to a new position in the apiary, where the bees can no longer find where the queen is from. They lose contact with them. Snags, you need to know it's happening, and it's fairly inconvenient. And it's important to note that this only happens if you do this method using a split board. If you do it using a separate stand, and we've done this a number of times for demonstration purposes, and it works just the same. But it only happens because there's a split board and they can find the queen. And this is actually what you see when you go to the hive, when it's been artificially swarmed for a couple of days, 3 days or whatever. You will see that the bees who are orientated on this entrance here are arriving here, and then they are following a crocodile of bees up. So they go in here, they found where the queen is. That's what you actually see. Right. If this is an out apiary, you're not going to be visiting it every few days to see this is happening. So it really doesn't work as a sensible method. I think it took about a couple of years deciding how to deal with this. And we had one of those, what I call a eureka moment, which is saying the question, what if? And the question was, what would happen if you gave the artificial swarm brood from which they could make emergency queen cells? Would this stop them looking for the queen? And yes, that's exactly what happened. It did stop them looking for the queen, and it solved that problem, but it also solved a much bigger problem. And as I said before, if we'd done this horizontally, we'd have never realized this point. So this is the same manipulation all over again, the same starter hive, and all the original brood of the queen cells gone onto the split board, right? And down here, you have now added 2 frames. We normally add 2 frames. It doesn't have to be 2, but we find it's more satisfactory because we've got this nice snug area here where queen cells can be produced. And these frames contain eggs and young larvae from which to make emergency queen cells. And the usual things happen, the flying bees come back and so on, just the same as before. And 9 or 10 days later, you come back. And of course, all the queen cells in here have been torn down, and the queen has resumed laying. And also, as you meant to happen, the bees down here have made emergency queen cells, and that's what stopped them from looking for the queen. And the queen is returned down here. But you have to, before you return the queen to here, you have to remove these queen cells because you can't introduce a queen now with queen cells here. So these queen cells are removed. And then there are 2 options open to the beekeeper. Because the queen has been laying up here, there is the means to make a new queen. Or if you are satisfied these queen cells have been well formed and nourished, you could actually transfer them to here, and they will cut the time for this, the parent colony, to requeen by 9 or 10 days. And we used to be rather cautious, thinking these queen cells might not have enough bees to feed them properly. But we are now pretty confident that they are perfectly okay to requeen this, and we normally put them into the parent colony, say, to save this 9 or 10 days. So the artificial swarm now is the means of making emergency queen cells. It prevents them from the queen. They make emergency queen cells. After 9 or 10 days, the queen cells are destroyed by the beekeeper or moved to the parent colony, and the queen is returned to the artificial swarm as before. The artificial swarm has had these queen cells, which are now actually, after 9 or 10 days, reaching a stage where the artificial swarm is actually conscious that they do contain queens. And it is the age, about day 11 or 12 in the development of a queen cell, the bees start to show a great interest in queen cells and start to investigate them intensively. And again, they use this vibration dance to investigate them. Presumably there are, by vibrating the cell, they are trying to get feedback information about its contents. But the colony realizes it's there. And the interesting thing is when you remove these cells and when they're expecting potentially a virgin coming into the hive, they seem quite happy to accept that instead of that, they get a laying queen. So they're quite happy to accept her. And this artificial swarm now resumes normal activity and makes no attempt to swarm, which is what we're trying to achieve. So this method works reliably. And it has one big advantage for the beekeeper, that is, you don't have to find the queen for the initial manipulation of this process, because trying to find a queen in a colony that is close to swarming, it can be very, very difficult, because she's been given the run around. She could be absolutely anywhere and probably running as fast as she can to get away from the bees that are harrowing, right? So the second manipulation, when the queen is back to her daily task of laying, she's much easier to find. And the only thing about this process is you have to get the timing right. If you leave the return of the queen and the removal of the emergency queen cell beyond about 9 and 10 days, you have an increasing risk that a virgin queen will emerge in the artificial swarm. And if this had happened, it would be very unwise, I think, to return the queen. I'm not quite sure what would happen, which queen would kill the other or what would happen, but it creates a situation that you don't want to create. It's not a disaster if you miss this timing, or for some reason you're not able to meet it. You just a change of plan. You leave the queen where she is, and the parent colony becomes the main honey producer. And you add the necessary supers to it and so on, and then you wait for the artificial swarm to requeen itself in its own time. So it's not the end of the world, as I've said. There is just one remaining question which I don't know the answer to. Will these queens, will the artificial swarm actually issue a swarm as these virgin queens start to emerge? And we have only actually missed the date once, and it didn't issue a swarm, but the testimony from other beekeepers, some of whom missed the time and some of whom haven't bothered to do it, and we get mixed testimony from them. Some say the artificial swarm does swarm and some say it doesn't. So I can't give a firm answer on that. The safety first method is of course when established to thin the queen cells down to 1. Although there is another method suggested in the of dealing with this situation in the swarm cells in my hive handbook, which we prefer to use, but I'm not going to deal with that now. So why does the method work so well? It does what it was designed to do, stops the bees in the artificial swarm finding the queen. But the most important effect seems to be that it switches the artificial swarm from swarming mode to emergency requeening mode. I mean, there's no real way of testing this, so this is the result of speculation, but all the evidence points that way. And you move forwards 3 to 4 weeks, and the new queen should be laying at the top, and now you have several options. You can run this double colony with its own supers. That's the method to get a skyscraper. You could remove the top colony to an out apiary and give it its independence as a new colony. You can give it independence in the same apiary, but it will take a hit because it will lose its flying bees. And you certainly, if you're going to do that, you need to wait at least until the queen has some of her own offspring who will not yet have learnt to fly. Or you can delay the decision until after the honey's been taken, and you could use that colony to requeen the one below if the queen is knocking on a bit, or you could make it independent in the same colony now. Right, so that's the same example again. This is one that we actually moved this one away to a new apiary as we took the honey crop and let this one become the new colony on this stand. Right. The problem of late swarming, as I said at the beginning, good preemptive swarm control can actually create this problem. You succeed in keeping a large colony through May and most of June, and in late June or July, this is our timing, just before the main flow starts, the colony starts queen cell. And this is very frustrating because you don't, it's the last point you want to split a colony. We have worked for about 5 years on this problem, and we have arrived at a method now that we have used with complete success now for 3 years, and that is described in the booklet. I'm not going to deal with that tonight. It's a bridge too far. So that really is the end of the talk, and now I am prepared to get rid of my screen if I know how. And how do I get rid of my screen? No, okay, I just can't get rid of my screen.
Very good, Wally. I'll jump in and let everybody know if you're interested in his books and booklets, send an email to officers@summitbeekeepers.com. Our hope is to order a box of books and distribute as requested. So let me know there's an interest and we will get the order in and let you know what it's costing.
The Beekeeping Association in California are doing that, in process of doing that thing now, because you actually get, you could import the book this way, and you can actually sell it cheaper than the beekeepers in Britain can buy it, because you get a trade price, and that more than covers the carriage. It's a strange business.
So Dawn
Well,
just submitted a question for you.
Yeah.
She feels ignorant, but wants to know how far away should a different apiary be apart?
Oh, well, do you have the same thing that we have? If you want to move a colony, you must move it less. If you want to move a colony and you want it to find where it lives, you move it less than 3 feet. If you don't want it to find its way back home, you move it 3 miles. But this very much depends on the time of year, the recent state of foraging. I mean, here on Anglesey, because we have quite a windy, cool climate, I very much doubt if any colonies forage much beyond a mile ever. And you have to get them out, you have to get it so that flying bees do not stray into their old neighborhood and return home. And that's all there is to it. In the middle of winter, we actually reposition colonies during a spell of poor weather, and after poor weather and they've been confined to the hive, when they first come out again, they relocate themselves and will quite happily accept that they are near home, but they won't find the way. And we at the moment, actually, we've got a number of colonies for the various reasons are not facing the way we would like them to in our apiary. We want them to face better in relation to the position of the sun, and most of those need just turning through 90 degrees to face the direction we want them to. And we turned those the other day, and we had 2 of the colonies wanted 180 degrees turn to go in the direction we want them to be in. So we turned them 90 degrees to start off with and let them get used to that, and then we'll, in a day or so's time, we'll turn the other 90 degrees so they're facing the way we want them. And we have actually populated changed the configuration of a whole apiary in the middle of the winter, and no harm came